series of broadcasts, or whatever these are, discussions, webinars, whatever, since the COVID crisis began. We should all now, just about now, be finishing our annual physical convening in Lugano. We are not, pretty obviously. And so this is I hope, something of a substitute. Lugano, we have announced, will be happening a year from now at the end of May, something to look forward to. And meanwhile, these webinars or web discussions have become, I think, an extremely valuable resource. We started off 3 months ago or so with them simply being a sort of huddle in which we compared notes and how to use Zoom for conferences, etc. They have grown more sophisticated. We've moved on to operational matters. And this fourth series, we want to sort of try and lift our heads up a bit and think more about the long term. Our focus remains on cultural districts. And by cultural districts, we don't just mean things with hard edges and an explicit governance apparatus. We mean really concentrations of cultural institutions or cultural organizations or cultural activity where in an urban context where those cultural institutions and activities also relate very explicitly to urban agendas and civic agendas as well as purely cultural agendas. This series is different in two respects. The first is that we've opened it up a little, and we've invited some new people in to oxygenate it, and I'm thrilled that we've extended the invitation to the World Cities Cultural Forum that Justine chairs. And as I say, the idea of this one is to lift our eyes up and think slightly more about the longer term. And I don't underestimate the difficulty of that. We're all looking at the figures. COVID has now passed the 100 million mark with over 500,000 deaths. The World Health Authority made some fairly gloomy prognostications yesterday about the long-term trend of the disease. And certainly in the US, and I think to some extent to the UK, there is sort of public policy chaos, or at least a uncertainty around public policy. And of course, COVID has laid bare, or the pandemic has laid bare, issues of racial justice and social inequity that have added a sort of complexity to things. So, this may well be the new normal or the next normal that we are currently in. It's a rather sort of intimidating thought, but it's definitely a possibility that we're in a sort of prolonged period of uncertainty, and therefore lifting up one's eyes and thinking about the long term is genuinely challenging. And that's really, we're going to talk about these topics in that light. I've got an outstanding panel to sort of to kick off these discussions. Manal, first of all, Manal Ataya is the Director General of Sharjah's Museums Authority. She is, I'm delighted to say, an active member of the advisory group that keeps GCDN on the straight and narrow. She has a very strong museological background. And Sharjah is, for those of you, I think most members know, but it's an extremely interesting model, both within the Middle East and beyond, of cultural development, an extremely sophisticated agenda, which extends so far beyond, as it were, the icon building aspect of things and deeply into the relationship between culture and society. And so I'm thrilled to have her. Justine, equally thrilled by Justine Simons, founder and chair of the World Cities Cultural Forum, and as importantly, deputy mayor of culture, and I think head of culture for a decade, at least within London, which is an enormous, an enormous mandate. And I think it's true to say she has been responsible for every statutory cultural strategy since the creation of the GLA, the Greater London Authority. And so within that, there are myriad, whether we're talking about the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, or whether we're talking about the Cultural Olympics and Paralympics, an enormous span of responsibility, before which she worked actively at the sharp end of festivals and related programming. And last alphabetically, but only alphabetically, Kim Marie Spence. Kim is a researcher and academic both at Southampton University and the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. She's a board member of Kingston Creative, which is a GCDN member, an active GCDN member, which is Kingston, Jamaica. She also has a fascinating research background. You know, she was a Rhodes Scholar. She then did her PhD in Australia on creative industries, a comparison of Bollywood, reggae, and K-pop, which has got to be one of the, you know, the most interesting cocktails, if you like, of music imaginable. So all three have something to contribute from, you know, very different perspectives, both geographical perspectives and perspectives of, you know, a policy role in a global city, a policy and operation role in a cultural district, and Kim's perspective, which is a sort of policy analyst on a sort of global scale. So, you know, let me start with, you know, one of those simple Socratic questions that are almost impossible to answer, I know, but will sort of get us into this territory. And that is, how do you plan ahead? In other words, in the sort of urgency of now and the opacity of the future, how should cultural districts, how should we all think about the future in a way that makes, you know, gives us some comfort that when and as we emerge into whatever environment we're operating in, we're not simply, you know, stuck in the status quo ante. What is the environment that we should be planning for, and how should we go about thinking about it? So I am going to throw that, you know, cruelly first to you, Justine, from the perspective from, you know, both hats, as it were, both the world cities and London. How do we think about the future?
Thanks, Adrian. And thanks for inviting me. You know, I think our friendship with GCDN is great. I think we're kind of two complementary bits of the story in a way, aren't we? Cities and
Yes.
districts. Just for people who might not know, the World Cities Culture Forum is a group of 40 global cities, and it's leaders like me, deputy mayors, commissioners for culture, those kind of senior officials in world cities whose job it is to kind of protect, support, grow, fund culture in those cities. And I think just like you folks, we've been having regular webinars to kind of really just understand this pandemic that we're in and what it means for us. And, you know, I think there's just so much we've been able to learn from each other, frankly, and we are all at different stages in the pandemic. So, for example, our Chinese cities are further down the line than some of the European cities, some of the American cities, Buenos Aires, etc. So we're all at different points in this journey. And so what has been really valuable is just kind of going through it together and people sharing and learning what they're discovering, how they're tackling these big issues. And so what I thought I'd do is, over the course of all these webinars we've been having, I've kind of tried to synthesize the top themes that have come through for world cities, which I think is probably might be helpful to just set that as the city context on COVID and culture. So I'll just run through them very quickly. The first is capturing the data. That is a #1 priority for all cities. We realised quite quickly that we just needed to get a handle on what was happening. And so we've all been modelling, commissioning studies to understand in a data sense what is the impact of COVID on culture in cities. And that can be about how it's affected communities, job losses, the economy, tourism. You know, we're all capturing that data and sharing it with each other. And the reason we need that is, you know, A, to advocate for culture in cities, and B, to make sure we're designing the best approach and using our kind of platforms in the best way. #2 common theme is the rush to digital, which you will all be familiar with. This kind of real shift to moving online brings with it, you know, incredible opportunities, masses of new audiences for people, but also some quite significant challenges. You know, in London, of all the communities that are technically living in poverty, 47% of those people don't have access to Wi-Fi. Another kind of challenge with the rush to digital is, of course, paying artists. You know, how do you monetize your content? How do you keep getting paid for your work when it moves online? So that's something that all cities are kind of grappling with. #3 is we've done lots and lots of work, as I'm sure you have, on how you unlock culture in cities. So we've been sharing our modeling, whether that's theatres or cinemas or the film industry, so that we're not all doing the same piece of work. So that's a big front of mind issue for a lot of cities. But unlocking, and then often a lot of cities rolling back, you know, and then opening up again. So we're sharing all of that. Theme 3 is about the behavioural side of it. We've talked a lot about what it means for public confidence and culture. Lots of cities are reporting a drop in public confidence in getting back out and about. Citizens are quite fearful about going to public buildings and public spaces. So we're just thinking quite a lot about what we can do to rebuild trust with our communities and encourage people back into culture. How can we build that trust and understand what needs to happen? In the UK, for example, there's been a kite mark now, a COVID-safe kite mark that lots of venues are signing up to. Building the arguments is another big theme. One of our cities said it's like the 90s again. You know, we've kind of gone back to basics, having to remake arguments we thought we'd won about the importance of culture. And what is quite kind of striking about this pandemic is that, you know, you're, as a city leader, you're sitting in a kind of crisis situation where there's real challenges with things like public health, public transport, food supply. You know, how on earth do you kind of champion culture within the mix of those very, very serious, difficult issues? So there's a real kind of return to basics, I think, in terms of advocating and thinking about how culture can survive and also play that more civic role. Theme 6 is equity and inclusion. What we've all seen is that COVID has reinforced existing inequality in lots of different ways. Lots of cities have been kind of fashioning relief efforts, and what they've realised is that it's very hard to reach the people who are already out of the loop or already difficult to reach. So a lot of effort to work out how relief packages can get to the right people in this kind of rapidly changing environment. Grassroots culture especially vulnerable. Theme 8 is the fragility in the labour market. So, you know, it will be familiar to you folks that, you know, COVID has thrown into really sharp relief the challenging working conditions for artists and freelancers and creative practitioners. Lots of cities for the very first time have started to design funding directly for individuals. Never really happened before. And then cities are realising, you know, that there's a kind of, with everything kind of being funneled through institutions, there is, you know, lots of people are losing out by that. There's kind of the independent freelance sector is very vulnerable in that dynamic, and COVID has amplified that. So that's something that lots of cities are talking about. Last few, cultural tourism. Loads of cities reliant on cultural tourism. In London, 4 out of 5 people come to London because of culture. In Austin, Texas, their tourism tax is the main funding stream for their arts sector. So that has been a big issue for all of us because, of course, international travel has collapsed, global tourism has collapsed. So loads of cities are starting local. They're talking about hyper-local. So everyone's starting on the high street, culture on the doorstep, culture on the balcony, to try and kind of build out from that very kind of local point. Theme 9 is working together differently. We've had a bit of a session on philanthropy about how to work more tactically with funders in this moment of crisis. The folks in New York are very kind of well versed in this, having dealt with kind of hurricanes and things. They've got good models that we've been learning from about how philanthropists have come together to address a city need, as opposed to an individual preference of the head of a philanthropic trust. And then finally, reforming recovery. So, you know, what is the opportunity to reinvent, rethink, and address those kind of bigger systemic issues? If you are doing, and also how we think. So I'll stop now.
Thanks. That's an extremely comprehensive agenda. I think I'm going to steal most of it for us. It's extremely thought through. May I just ask how? I'm sure all GCDN are curious. So the forum is I assume like GCDN in that it's basically about information sharing of best practice, networking, pooling ideas. So do you intend that those streams are sort of carried forward as distinct lines of forum work?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say we're kind of like feeling our way with it, you know. Yeah. and some things are kind of moving up and up the agenda. So, you know, when we started meeting, the first thing we talked about was equity and inclusion, and that was before the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, kind of really went in this mainstream way. So something like that, for example, has kind of like moved up and up and up under. You know, so and then cultural tourism, lots of us have got cultural tourism agencies who deliver the tourism piece, so we're working with them. So I think we're just finding our way, to be honest. And I think just like you know, we were going to have our global summit in Milan in the autumn. That's not
very
possible
close to
anymore.
us. Yeah,
So we're looking, I think, yeah. So I think we're just looking at what we can do to just kind of synthesize and bring all this stuff together in one in the autumn, be it online. Just to kind of push forward. You know, there might be some new data we might realize that we really need around the world. We'll certainly be pooling all the economic data that we've all been collecting to kind of somehow paint that global picture.
Thanks.
Yeah, but
really
feel free to steal this.
Yeah, we will. To be continued. So Manal, can I pick up some of that territory, you know, from your perspective, which is with a portfolio of, I think, 16 museums, all quite closely physically located. And you are thinking, you know, very much about those operational needs, but you also have a sort of strategic policy perspective as well. But you're sort of, you're in not a unique position, but you're in that sort of position that I think a lot of members are, where they have operational needs, they have staff who are absolutely feeling the pressure of the moment and looking for guidance. You know, when will this end? What, you know, what does the long term look like? And you're sort of, you know, there's an American metaphor, I think, from some obscure American thought, running interference between those two worlds. So I would love to know how you are thinking about planning for the longer term in that context.
I think, you know, it's been very challenging the last few weeks or months. You know, the UAE, though, luckily has had relatively low number of cases and very, very high testing, which has been wonderful. So generally, although a lot of people have been feeling the challenge of, you know, being home, having to be isolated and not being able to, you know, be out, has been difficult for a lot of people. And I think, you know, there was a lot of, as mentioned earlier, this rush for digital, and it helped, I think, a lot of people to feel like they had something, you know, to learn from. They could watch something, they could get their mind off a lot of things. And we got very quickly reacted to that, and we did put a lot of things online. But of course, I personally had a internal struggle about all of this. You know, I'm not a reactive person. I don't like to react just to everything. I think everything needs a thought, a process, and, you know, really thinking about what will happen after and all of that. But we just didn't have time to do that. So there was a lot of, I would say, also kind of pressure, I think, from other, you know, entities and people saying, what are you doing? You need to do something. And what I found, I think, most difficult, which is what I'm taking forward, is that the communication was not really there with other entities within the UAE as a whole. With my counterparts in Sharjah, Emirate, we were, you know, talking to each other, and I was sending them information, even things that came up through GCDN that was useful. I send it along, and we would, you know, be sharing information. But I noticed with other creative sectors, there wasn't any of that kind of, you know, platform for coordination. And as Justine even mentioned earlier, for data sharing, you know, we just didn't know how to do that. So what's great, though, is that, you know, since this has happened, a, you know, proactive sort of led community group has been put together by different heads of organizations, and I'm in that. And it's really it's completely organic. You know, someone from a gallery in New York University, Abu Dhabi, said, you know, let's put this together with some other people. And they've been having these conversations about what to do with things, you know, regarding the UAE's issues, in terms of a lot of artists, for example, like you mentioned earlier, freelancers were finding themselves out of a job, but they also didn't know what their rights were, in terms of, do they get compensated for things that were canceled and they've already finished the work, you know, things like that. they were grants that were suddenly, put into the picture, but a lot of artists didn't know how to apply for the grants. They were confused as to what were the, criteria. I think even, some of the people who put the grants together were unsure of how best to do it. So we clearly saw that the effectiveness was not, not there in terms of some of the things that were being put together. But I think what we've realized is if we had communicated better, and if we continue to do that now, we will be able to advise bigger bodies, bigger government organizations that are higher up sort of in the line about how to do things better so that they can respond quicker to these issues. Because what I noticed is for organizations that are smaller and for people like myself who get very involved in a lot of the details, we were quick to respond, figure out things, etc. But I think for larger organizations, it's much harder. The bureaucracy and the autonomy is not there for smaller groups to kind of, make decisions, be creative, and figure out what to do. So I feel, have this obligation now to really inform those bigger organizations about how best to maybe go about things, because we're on the ground, as you said, we're the ones operating, we're the ones meeting and interacting and engaging with our audiences and our artists and everyone else in that creative sector. And we have to, better inform them about how to go about, making new policy changes, giving out micro grants, whatever it might be that could be very helpful now and in the future. But I guess to answer even the question in a shorter way, it's just that I think there is a lot to do now. I don't think the programming in terms of next year, what we're going to do exhibition-wise is not really on my mind. I think there's a lot I can do now when things are uncertain, which is look at the structure of our, organization. How can it be more autonomous? How can it be less, let's say, driven, from top up? I'm looking at how I can support my digital staff. So my IT department is going to get a big chunk of new funding for the next year because they've wanted it for a long time, but we've always had to cut it out. But this clearly has made us realize that the digital strategy should be supported. And I saw from our statistics, we had double the amount of interaction. Actually, 80% were new users during this period. So 80% is a huge chunk of people that were never entered our website before, or even opened our pages. So that means that we've got a new audience, we've attracted new people, and so I want to continue to cultivate that. And then again, I think the last part is really thinking about the audience and the value issue that I think we will talk about more. How can we ensure that our mission, our strategic goals are really going to continue to add this value, that cultural value that we're all kind of thinking about now and actually in a way being tested, right? Are we actually valuable? Do we add value to our communities? People are asking that question. And I think this is something that we can be doing right now with different initiatives and different ways of listening to people in our community.
So I'm going to ask Kim too this question about the articulation of value, but before I get there, I'd love to sort of pick up. So this is a period presumably of straitened financial circumstance, but it's also a period in which cultural districts and the anchors of those districts are sort of acknowledging a set of wider priorities.
Right.
Around social justice, around equity, and also we were just, slowly getting to the agenda of climate change before COVID came along. We have, I think, the discussion around anchors is very interesting in that it highlights, and I'm not sure that we have always responded in good faith, the importance of freelancers and the gig economy and all the artists and creatives who are not formally part of the institutional structure, but are critical to the wider ecology of those anchors. So this is a lot of responsibility. In a period of straitened financial circumstances. So I'm interested in both your and Manal's sort of, is this realistic? You've identified that you've got to look at a more agile organization. You've got to look at an organization where you are explicitly redeploying resources, for example, to the virtual. So, I guess two questions to you both. The first is, how practical is that agenda? How doable is that agenda? It's an aspiration, but give us a bit more sort of texture as to how one goes about it. And then the second, to you, Kim, particularly, is clearly we're going through a period when it is critically important that districts articulate value. We have been through 20 years. I think the first time I met Justine was at a seminar that I think she and I were part of called Valuing Culture with John Holden and Vera. And we were talking then about the oversimplicity of economic impact and how it needed to be broadened in various ways. And we've been through, we're a lot more sophisticated than we were. But isn't there a sort of, if there's ever been a need to be able to express compellingly and straightforwardly the social and civic value of culture, we're in it now. And I'm just intrigued to know whether we're equipped to do that. So let me get to you first, and then back to Manal. Kim, go for the value proposition. What is it and how are we doing on it?
Okay, so all right, I'll do the value proposition, then a little on financial. The value proposition is interesting listening to Justine and Manal talk about, we have to make these arguments again, because one of the things that came out of lockdown, paradoxically, is that people relied on culture to get through it, relied on the watching, and then moved on to less familiar channels as lockdown continued. And that's shown by research coming out of the Policy and Evidence Center here, but also on the ground, you see, I'm speaking from the perspective of Kingston Creative and also from being on the board of the John Hansard Gallery here in Southampton, and people turned to culture. And so there was a demand for culture, even as cultural workers were feeling the brunt of this crisis. So it's paradoxical. So in a sense, I think the conversation about culture, and I guess also coming from institutions that are non-governmental, Kingston Creative is a citizen-led cultural districts initiative. The John Hansard Gallery is part of the University of Southampton. So coming from those perspectives, there's a sense that the justification is even stronger now for people wanting that kind of cultural content, something to take their mind off of COVID and just how they relied on the arts, etc., as part of that. With Kingston Creative, the whole notion of the financial issues, we found that there had to be a balance between our own values and adaptation to COVID-19. So it wasn't just, we have a monthly requirement, a monthly event slog of an art walk each end of month that is coupled with a market street and a meetup of creatives within Kingston. And the initial move was move everything online, but you also realize even before the BLM movement of the digital divide was very clear, very early. Even some of our adaptations hasn't just been move things online. The team with Andrea Chung, the executive director, and I think I saw our art district manager, Verily, hi Verily, online. It's, part of it has also been about being, for us, we have a duty to our community. We are, Adrian spoke about the anchors, but for some of the cultural districts, we are a cultural district in the sense that our anchor is the outside, not the inside. And so that is going to have a huge impact on our return to normal, or the new normal, or the next normal, because the outside is very much where we were based. And that that has its disadvantage, but the advantage that we've had also is that we were already tapped into the community. So we had to live up to values. There was no choice to do otherwise. So one of the major programs that has come out of COVID-19 that is a sense of digital commissions. So we've continued paying artists, etc. And so in this moment, COVID forced us to not only adapt, but to look at our own values. What is it that we stand for at this moment? It wasn't just about putting content online. It was how we did it, because we have partners that we had to talk to and to say that we are living up to those values. But in the academic space that I come from, that has also started a whole conversation about what is cultural value. I don't know if I should stop there, because I know that's a whole conversation, but it has definitely moved beyond just audience numbers. It has moved into a more health and wellness aspect because we saw people, this was the crutch, and I'm sure any of my fellow panelists can talk about in the first days of lockdown, which movies you watch. That was which music did you turn to? It wasn't just about the essential requirements, but it was about the cultural requirements, and that has been a big part of the move here in Kingston and also in Southampton, where for the children that were on the wrong side of that digital divide, there was a whole program to send out art in boxes, like coloring, crayons, etc. And that has been part of the outreach. So I think we're talking about two levels of values: the organizational values, but also a bigger question of cultural value, and then the finances come into it.
Manal, let me pick that thread up and go back to you on both counts, really. One is, you talked very eloquently about the need to in a sense reorganize for the environment in which you're moving, redeploying resources, making the organization more agile. I've heard that again and again talking to people, and embracing a set of responsibilities that are wider than the already wide responsibilities that the cultural sector has sort of not appropriated, but taken on civic, economic, etc. What's the reality of that? How do you go about that? What's your advice to others where you're ahead of the slightly ahead of them in thinking about basically a form of organization that is more adapted to the circumstances into which it's moving? Well,
I think I'm not a believer in talking about things theoretically and then it doesn't actually happen on the ground and in practice. I think probably if you're looking at positives of a pandemic, is that it made reality for us all something that we had to face. I think it's not a scenario. So I've always been a plan B, C, D scenario person, and often my team and my colleagues would say, kind of like, I could see them sort of chuckle like, well, that's never going to happen. Plan B and C will never have to do that. But I think now this has been really eye-opening, because this is something we could not control. It was something that affected everyone without any guarantees. And I think this has allowed them to really see that they really do have to change their mindset and have a growth mindset. Embrace this idea of, we have to have a mindset where we grow and we change the way we think about what we're doing and how we do it in particular. And just using COVID and what we're going through right now as an example will help my team, I believe, really move pretty quickly into understanding that, having everything done a particular way where it takes weeks or months to get something off the ground, we might have to do that quicker, and I think we can do that quicker. It just means maybe I don't have to approve everything, or someone else can delegate. We can delegate and we can flatline management a little bit better, particularly in the creative area of, let's say, marketing and digital strategy, etc. Because they have to respond quickly to things like this in general, and I think that's one area we can focus on. I also think in the area of, for example, just thinking of allocating resources, that's just a decision that had to be made because we actually had to put in, if you can believe it, submit our budget for next year. We submitted it last week. So it's tough. For the government, we actually had to submit our 2021 budget allocation. So I had to think to myself, oh my God, what am I going to budget for next year when I don't even know if half of or some of the budget I'll even use it this year? What I not do, will I be doing it next year? Or just scrap it all together and now spend it on something else. So quick decisions were made, and I have to say they were not easy, and I'm sure I've made mistakes, but that's okay. I think we just have to approach this pragmatically and understand that, you know, we're not going to do it perfectly. There is no actual answer, especially not one that's going to work universally for all of us anyway. So we just got to work with what we have and listen and use the resources around us. And I think I definitely have been much more resource heavy, and I've noticed my staff have too. So I was amazed that I have a log every week that my staff send me about what they've been doing. The amount of webinars and online things they've been engaged with I've never seen. It's like skyrocketed. And now they're coming to me with, oh my God, I read about this, or I heard about this, or I was watching this, and I think we can do this. And that to me is very exciting because it means that they have been they feel empowered because of the information that's been shared, which normally, like, these conversations would not be online. They would not be recorded, especially. So no one could, you know, be involved after this conversation, and a lot of information was lost. So I think that's, in a practical sense, has really helped, I think, give motivation for a lot of people that we can do this. And I think we're just going to take it in some way baby steps, and in other ways we're going to leap forward because we have no other choice. I think we've got to keep that planning going, and we're still planning new museums, new refurbishments. We're going to do it, but we are taking into account that the public and the way it congregates will be different perhaps, and we can think about that for the future. And we're just looking as much as we can at academic literature and articles and everything we can find that can help us to navigate that. But I think practically, they're just I think from next week we're all at work, and we're going to meet together. I'm going to talk about how we're going to try to move forward, what we've learned, lessons we've learned from this situation, and that no, we should not return to the way we were before. Because in my mind, that's kind of how some people deal with trauma in a not healthy way. They pretend it never happened. They try to erase it from their memory and say, let's go back to the way it was before. But to deal with trauma, to make it useful to you, if you've had to deal with it in some form, is to engage with it, to understand it, to face it, and to eventually, you know, befriend it is the best thing you can do, to understand better how you deal with those kinds of emotions. And I think that's probably the hardest part, is to get people to do that, because a lot of them want to just pretend this didn't happen and go back to a time when, you know, everything was okay. But it can't possibly do that. I think it's a mechanism temporarily, but it will hit you hard later on. So I'm going to encourage that as much as possible, that we open that up for the well-being of our institution and also our visitors in the future.
Justine, can I ask you two questions? One is the issue of public value, and I'm interested to know whether the question of whether the way in which you, both in your deputy mayoral responsibilities in that policy function, or more generally the World Cities Forum, Cultural Cities Forum network, where value and assessing value through polling and other techniques is relevant. I'd love to know whether there is a parallel discussion in your network around organizational agility. You know, the not-for-profit world is appropriately, you know, risk averse. We have structures in order for them not to do reckless things. Their fiduciary responsibilities, etc. We tend to be quite hierarchical. During the COVID crisis, we became remarkably nimble quite quickly. We, you know, learned to work virtually. We learned how to work in teams, etc., in ways that are less siloed than they have been historically. And I think that, you know, certainly in the conversations we've been having, there is a desire not to let go of that, as it were, to hang on to that nimbleness and that willingness to sort of, you know, make radical redeployment of resources in ways that we couldn't in peacetime, as it were. So I'm interested to know, you know, so two areas, you know, deal with them consecutively. One is the value proposition, and the other is just about, you know, organizational adaptability if we are entering a period of prolonged turbulence, and whether, you know, organizational cultural changes are, you know, part of what we need.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're, I think so. Yes, go.
Yeah, cool. Great, yeah. So I was just thinking about this question of polling and, you know, a conundrum, which I'm sure is reflected in other cities, but just talk London. So this isn't exact, it kind of moves a little bit. But if you ask, whenever we do public polling, right, if we ask the question, what is the most important thing you care about in your city? The answer is a version of the environment, crime dropping, transport, good education, right? They move up and down, but, you know, depending on what's happening in London, that's broadly what people say they always care about. If you change the question, you say, what is it? Why do you live in London? What is it you love about London? Why is living in London important to you? Mostly they say culture, right? So that's very difficult for us as kind of civic leaders to kind of make the arguments, you know, because of the way in which kind of that kind of public polling works and what people really care about when it can push can shove. So it's that, I think it's always that question of kind of trying to put front of mind what's lost if culture disappears. You know, what will happen if theatres close for good? What will happen if there's no music and you can't access Netflix, all of that, you know, to Kim's point. But it's hard. I think as kind of city leaders, we have to be adept at speaking to different audiences, and we have to be basically, you know, making the case for culture, the value for culture, just according to our audience, honestly. And I mean, the phrase I use in London is hardwiring. So, you know, in our team in London, our job is to hardwire culture into all of our public policy. That's what we see we're doing. And that is into planning, is into education, is into health, is into regeneration. You know, we don't see ourselves as a kind of culture department operating a small grant program and doing some interesting festival stuff. We see ourselves as a kind of systemic change program in the city. So, you know, so we're speaking to lots of different audiences. And I think the challenge for us in that value proposition is to make sure that when we pivot, we're talking about institutions and creative leaders and artists, that we understand enough about our sector that we don't overload people to do things that they're not set up to do, that is outside their mission and they're not resourced to do. So we have to kind of like make the big, you know, kind of, you know, advocacy job for culture in all of these different areas, but we have to also kind of find the resources and make and support our kind of cultural sector in an appropriate way, so that, you know, where there are opportunities to operate in a wider policy sense, whether that's in health and education and regeneration, that our cultural sector is supported, resourced and geared up to do that if they want to do that and if it fits their mission. So you're kind of, you know, you're juggling a lot, I think, as a kind of public policy leader in a city government. Shall I answer part two?
Yeah, go on. Go for it.
That organisation. Yeah. So that was organisational agility. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's, you know, we have digital kind of working and home has been accelerated, hasn't it? You know, and I think, I mean, a live question for all of us, I think, is that although on one level we've all responded to it really well and we're all managing it and we're all sitting on Zoom calls, we've got to be mindful that it's taken its toll. It's not an ideal situation. I've been sitting on my dining room chair for weeks now. And also, you know, a lot of people in the cultural sector, you know, are low paid, you know, don't own their own property, don't have a garden, are sitting in their bedrooms, you know. So I think we have to move forward carefully, is what I'd say, you know, even on the face of it seemed like we snapped into a new world order, but in fact, you know, we should be kind of mindful of that, you know, of kind of moving through a transition that works and really.
Yes, the this sense of a broader responsibility for staff welfare as well as employee welfare as well as public welfare is I think right to the fore for everyone, and it's and I'm not sure whether, you know, currently we feel like we have the tools for it, the sort of, you know, right down to the tacit knowledge transfer. If you're sitting next to people, if you're walking about with them, there's all sorts of ways informally in which you are monitoring, you know, their welfare as well as teaching them things that they might not otherwise absorb. You know,
I mean,
Zoom doesn't take it so far. Sorry,
I think the other point, just to respond, I think the other point I'd make is just, you know, the point I made before about the inequality and fragility of the labour market and how COVID has absolutely amplified the terrible working conditions of artists and freelancers who've dropped through the net, who've kind of, all their work has collapsed. And I think, you know, from an institutional perspective, you know, I think that's really an area to start to kind of imagine a new paradigm about how institutions work individuals, because clearly it's not working, and COVID has amplified it even more. You know, and certainly I'm sitting on the board of the Arts Council in London, and certainly that is top of mind for the Arts Council and the major funders. And I think, you know, for institutions the same, you know, all the people who are most fragile have got.
No, I definitely like that we've come to that point about talking about the fragility of cultural workers, because, you know, we've always, academics, yeah, I think the last Arts Council England report was, you know, talking about the creative case for diversity. We've known that this is not sustainable, and COVID has made that clear. Both, you know, the gig economy, etc. Kingston Creative, for example, in that kind of adaptability has had to think not just about its survival, but the survival of the artists who've contributed to its growth to date. And again, on top of the conversation, there are the intersectional issues for museums, for cultural districts, etc., of the representation of the variety and diversity of our populations in what we do and being held to account in that way. So it's also the gig economy and then the intersections of race, class, and gender that COVID, I mean, we've all been talking about this. Kingston Creative is in the most heritage, one of the most heritage rich areas of Kingston, but also one of, you know, at home to a number of marginalized communities. Reggae, given its message, did not come from the upper echelons of society, right? It came from marginalization, and so then moving that forward into this era, being aware of those issues in terms of just what we present. So we don't present the easiest, which tends to come from certain populations, but we also realize that we still have to do the kinds of work that we used to do in the physical work, which is in the physical world, which is to reach out to other populations. I think I will throw in a sideball in terms of one of the programs that Kingston Creative has been doing is a mass program, and that has been a way of hiring sewers in different communities to make masks. I think it's the 1,000 Masks project for the people of the community. And, you know, and that's been also part of the initiative going forward, that you have to think about culture in its much broader senses. I neglected to mention a point about the financial aspects. One of the interesting things from a Jamaican perspective has been that we haven't had partners falling out, but partners that seen those wider initiatives of moving art walks online or having digital boot camps or the Mass Project have actually committed to supporting these initiatives. So I think there's also a wider reevaluation of value that is happening in our societies that we represent one particular perspective of it, but there's a wider reevaluation happening, and I hope it happens in London, Justine.
I'm aware that we have 25 minutes, and I'm also aware that there's some great questions out there. So I'm going to try a sort of a technological miracle, and I'm going to try and Vile in Port of Spain, I'm going to try and literally patch you into the conversation to ask your question. If I fail, then I'll just be you and I'll read it. But let's see whether this works.
I believe in you, Adrian.
Yeah, I believe. Well, it's good. Okay, are you there? Belief. Yeah, you're there. Okay, go for it. Unmute. Do I have to unmute you, or do you have to unmute yourself?
I think she's been unmuted.
Okay.
I think I'm unmuted. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm actually in Kingston, Jamaica, but
Okay.
while I'm listening to this conversation, I'm getting news reports about a violent uprising in Port of Spain in Trinidad, with confrontations between as yet not quite clear what is happening, but confrontations with the police all over the city, right? And shootouts and so on. So, there have been violent uprisings in various parts of the world recently. Some of them have just been peaceful demonstrations that were responded to inappropriately. Others have been events of a somewhat more violent nature themselves. So my question is really, this is going to happen in some art districts, if it has not already happened. We have had the issues with the monuments and so on. How do art districts really best position themselves in that? I see them as potentially offering safe spaces, as offering a space for conversation, for peaceful protests. But of course, there's also the matter of how do you protect the assets that you are responsible for in your art district. So it's a difficult line between those two issues. So I really just wanted to get some perspectives on that, because I think it is part of the reality we all face right now. Thank you.
No.
Thank you. I just wanted to answer quickly that question. We don't have, those kinds of monuments where I'm from. Of course, I've been very involved in reading the news, and I know exactly a lot of what those are and have seen them myself. Why I'm put my hand up to answer this question is that I've heard from a lot of people that one of the answers to this problem is, why don't we put all these statues in museums? So then they'll be safeguarded, but they won't be in a public space anymore. It's an interesting solution to this issue. I don't think it is the right solution per se, but I do believe that, and I've always believed that it's wrong to destroy, the cultural heritage or history of any place. But I do believe some things are hurtful. I believe some things are, let's say, offensive to people, because times change and we're more informed and more knowledgeable about suffering and tragedy and everything else that all kinds of people have gone through in different parts of the world. And I think it's very important to contextualize those things. And I don't think ruining them is the best way forward. And I think museums can play a part in that, whether that is perhaps keeping some of the things that are the most glaring. I think also explaining why that is important to understand why this particular statue should not be, let's say, on a college campus or in front of this place or whatnot. I think we need to explain that to our public, and usually monuments don't have that explanation at all. And they're not contextualized, they're just in a way glorified, and when they probably shouldn't be. So I think museums, whether it's through having them in storage, whether that's putting them on, some of them on display, perhaps even an exhibition on what this whole thing means, and trying to understand better what to do with statues and monuments that have a really heavy sort of meaning behind them that is upsetting for a lot of communities. I do want to say also that one person who's actually a lawyer, a judge actually, sorry, told me, you know, it's terrible to get rid of statues of villains, as he called them, and dictators, because then people will forget what they've done and what we've had to fight to change. And this came from someone who's Sudanese. So he, you know, went through a time, as you know, with South Sudan, and there's been a lot of problems there with Islamic issues, these certain types of groups and things like that. So he was talking a lot about that. And of course, with the Arab Spring, there was a lot of uprising in a lot of North Africa, and there's a lot of dictatorship there. And it's important for people to remember who these people are, what they did, and why there was an Arab Spring in the first place. So it's important. I understand it's a very complex topic, but I think there is something to be said about the museum maybe, or other cultural institutions playing a bigger role in breaking down and explaining some of the meanings and the context to which some of these monuments and things in a way stand for.
Justine? London, this
yeah, London.
big deal. How are you approaching it?
Yeah, no, this is a really kind of live issue for us, so thanks for asking about it. So we've there's big calls for lots of statues to come down in London and across the UK. Quite recently, statue of Robert Milligan was taken down to the Museum of London. I know the director of the museum wants to keep that statue and put it inside the museum. I think the thing is, there's lots of different opinions floating around, you know. As Manal has said, you know, some people say put them in museums, some people say change the plaque so a more accurate story is told, some people say take them down, some people say don't erase our history, when of course, you know, often they just speak of a partial history, they don't tell, in fact, they are themselves only telling a bit of a story and not a full kind of truthful version of that history. So there isn't a consensus. So one of the things we're going to try in London is to put together a commission on diversity in the public realm. And the purpose of this is to create a space for that conversation so that we can move away from these kind of, you know, flashpoint moments where people are kind of trying to kind of, you know, take statues down and things. And just to create that space, because people sit on a continuum, you know, there are groups of people who say, let's just take it down, let's just throw in a kind of rope around it. And then there's other people who know that that statues and monuments on their land, in their spaces, have, you know, very difficult histories and legacies, and they want to know what to do about them. They want help, you know, they want, how do they navigate a process to build some consensus, to decide on the best course of action, to kind of either remove that statue, you know, or whatever the course of action is. So the commission is going to be the space for, you know, for a conversation. It's going to be a space to give advice and guidance for people who want to kind of, boroughs, for example, landowners who want to kind of go on a more facilitated journey about this thing. Yeah, and also I think, you know, we want to look at commissioning new stuff. You know, I think the focus is a lot about taking things down. And, you know, if I look at London, it is a kind of mirror of Victorian Britain. You know, there's a kind of proliferation of bronze statues that were commissioned in Victorian times. And, you know, if you look at what legacies we need to be celebrating now that reflect all of our communities, and also who are the artists and creatives who are making that work, you know, what kind of murals, what about street names? It's not just about statues. In a way, that's a kind of just part of a story. So hopefully the commission will create that space for conversation, will help people to kind of navigate through difficult kind of public realm issues, and also look at how we can inject some kind of quality and diversity and fresh voices and new legacies in the commission of new things that populate our public realm. I mean, to your point, actually, Manal, about the role of institutions, I think you're right. I think that institutions have got a really important role to play in all this, but I think it's not without complexity, you know, because a lot of our cultural institutions are institutionally racist. You know, there is institutional bias and racism in our institutions, and lots of the objects, you know, contained in some of our museums and galleries, you know, have come from communities without their permission. So I think it's a complicated thing for an institution, you know, to kind of play, you know, a constructive role in this. in a way that kind of recognises, you know, their own complicated, you know, often kind of complicit role in the story, you know.
I think it's an interesting point that Verily brings up, especially coming from the Caribbean that is so defined by post-coloniality or you know, memories often in bronze, concrete, whatever, of coloniality. In listening to Manal and Justine, I'm realizing something that I think would be interesting for us GCDNers to also acknowledge how much space, how much power there is in taking up space. You know, by definitions of world cities or cultural districts, we're defined spatially. And I think, you know, we and maybe it's me talking aloud about myself, but, you know, in terms of like the downtown Kingston art district, I think about it in terms of art and the you know, cultural expression, etc. But we also have to realize that the taking up of space is a political act. And I think that is why there's been so much emotion towards these things that have been taking up space, even unconsciously around us. I think also it brings into, I've been talking a lot about values, but I really do think in terms of our strategy as cultural districts, we're talking about culture and cultural expression, symbolism, etc. And these are all as important to our strategy as to getting content out, right? Because it will determine what our content is. And it speaks to the issue of cultural democracy. You know, Justine talks about it's almost like London is frozen in time. Things want to occupy space that represent 21st century London. Kingston Creative, for example, has a Paint the City program. So it's not statues, and it also speaks to the issues of economics too. It's murals, right? And how quickly the different communities were requesting murals in their communities because you wanted a representation of your community that, you know, that you were a part of, etc. So this whole thing, and I think it's no different. Even now, that has been one of the first physical, you know, manifestations post-COVID or during COVID of going back into different communities and making murals, because that has such a cognitive impact on how we see the places around us, which is our very raison d'etre for cultural districts, right? So I think it's a very important question that we have to consider. So who makes it? What is occupying space in our cultural districts?
I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to solicit another one. I've got two great sets of questions. One from Christos in Athens and one from Marcella in Buenos Aires. And I'd love to get them both aired and at least sort of inhaled in the next 10 minutes if we can. So I'm going to, Christos, I'm going to try and do the same thing with you. Just give me 1 second and bring you in. And a quick plug, he wrote a fantastic paper that was published over the weekend on a sort of a general overview of the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural sector in Europe, which is fantastically researched and very eloquent. So I'll just give you that plug. But okay, I'm bringing you in now. Hang on, allow to talk. Okay, you in? Yeah, I think either we or Nina. Yeah. Go.
Okay. You can hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you, Adrian. And thank you all, and thanks, Adrian, for the plug. Much appreciated. Quickly then, because there's not much time. 2 questions. First, I think for all 3 of the panelists. I was wondering whether the experience has prompted you to rethink the role of infrastructures. In other words, a lot of the time, especially when we're talking about engaging communities, one of the problems is that communities don't feel that they're welcome in infrastructures, large cultural infrastructures. So have you been thinking about ways devising ways for people to use the infrastructures differently, or even enabling them to construct their own local infrastructures within their community so that they can become more engaged with the cultural process? And the second question is perhaps more for Manal and Kim, because it relates to programming. And I was wondering whether this experience has prompted any changes to programming strategies in terms of the content that you're wanting to get out to your communities. Thank you very much.
And I should just add, if those sound like the questions of somebody who's got a sort of analytical bent, it's true, but Christos is also the director of, most importantly, of the Onassis Center in Athens, which is a fantastic multi-art form center right in the middle of Athens. So,
thank you.
Who first?
Well, Adrian, can he actually clarify one of the questions? When you asked about programming, do you mean in terms of content because of COVID, or do you mean in terms of what's going on with BLM or sorry, I wasn't sure what you meant.
Yes, fair enough. I meant more generally whether you believe that there's any kind of tension involved in wanting to reach out and engage communities, but also perhaps programming in a way that may be perhaps challenging at the same time. So it's really not so much about COVID per se, but yes, certainly issues of racial injustice and social inequality are always present in artistic content. But I was wondering if there's any tension between the need to engage with communities more on the one hand, and also some kind of, shall I say, curatorial independence on the other hand. It's something that is a big issue in my mind as at the same time someone who is reaching out to communities, but also trying to sort of keep on programming challenging content. And I was wondering whether this kind of issue is there for you as well.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead, Kim?
Yeah, sure. All right, let me start. So I know Pixar had started with infrastructure. I think, from the Kingston creative perspective, we are in the outside. So we, before COVID, were moving more towards infrastructure, more to, and like the creation of a creative hub, etc. So that has not been that relevant a question for us because it has been the moving online. The issue has been not all the communities can move online in the same way. And there has been a digital divide, which we're addressing with different programs, like going online and teaching people how to access the digital space, the digital skills that some might take for granted are new skills for others. And so that dealing with the digital divide in that way. In terms of content, the issues of the BLM, as I noted before, have always been issues in Jamaica, and then more so heightened with COVID. We find for content and programming, it's the tension is less curatorial and the community, but more that we have our communities expanding at different ends of the spectrum. On one hand, we've become, hyper local. People are in lockdown, but on the other hand, you're now open to a much wider group of people. Normally, you would have had to be present physically in Kingston, Jamaica to go to an art walk, for example. Now, there was a Windrush virtual exhibition. Windrush is one of the ships that took the post-war, that is, the symbol of post-war Caribbean immigration to the UK to deal with labor shortages. There was a whole virtual exhibition from a Jamaican artist, and that definitely was very much geared towards a diasporic audience that we would not have normally been able to tap into. So now it's a balancing between a really hyper local and a really hyper international or diasporic, which are new audiences, and balancing the content for that. And also on a practical level, the learning that has happened. I remember the first virtual art walk and where we are now, people learning how to do this. Like, for example, I watched a performance this weekend as part of our meetup, and people knew that they had to bring someone into that space to do a performance. So there has been a learning that has happened how to do it. There will not be a return to pre-COVID. It's also opened up the space for the kind of talent we can use. Before, again, you were confined to those in that physical space. Now you can use talent from all over, the wider, and especially for Jamaica, where there's a Jamaican diaspora and then there's a reggae diaspora. And so we can tap into a much wider cultural space. But again, the tension now is, but we do have to be responsible for an audience that is requiring, that is where we are, and also draws not just cultural expression and income, but also a sense of health, wellness, and identity from those programs. So I'll leave it there. I could go on, but I'll leave it.
I said about London.
Yes, go. Sorry.
Shall I quickly? Yeah. So cultural infrastructure, I think what I'd say from the London perspective is that, the grassroots cultural infrastructure has been super hard hit. We've already been doing quite a lot of work knowing how fragile that part of the cultural infrastructure story is. So by that, I mean tiny grassroots music venues, LGBT plus clubs, artist studios, and what has happened in COVID, of course, is they've all been, already they're fragile, but they've become super fragile. So we've done quite a lot of work supporting them. We set up a culture at risk office, which I describe as the bat phone. So it's a kind of helpline really for people who are kind of struggling with landlords, with licensing, with rent, with legal challenges, with where to go for funding. And just to give you a kind of sense of it, over the mayoral term, which is 4 years long, we had about 350 cases. Just since COVID in March, we've now got over 500 new cases. So we've actually been stealing members of other people's teams to help us cope with the demand to support the cultural infrastructure in the city. And we've got a small cultural infrastructure grant funding, which is tiny, small grants to help tide people over to keep them on life support, independent cinemas, etc. So that's quite a big piece of our work. I think the other thing that we've been up to is we've got a cultural infrastructure map. So we've got a digital open source map now of all the granular, very small cultural infrastructure. Because often if you are a local council, you often don't know what's in your borough, because if it's a studio, it might not be public facing, so you might not know it even exists. So we've been building this granular picture of a small scale community cultural infrastructure. And that's come into its own in COVID, because we can start to really see what's going wrong and tracking the changes. I think that the other thing I'd say about infrastructure is one of our other kind of policy innovations over recent years has been the establishment of creative enterprise zones. So they're not districts. It's a kind of it's a planning zoning. So to be a zone, you have to have affordable creative workspace, and you have to, half of it is about space and half of it is about people. So it's about kind of skills and training and making sure that as those small creative businesses grow and develop, the jobs are going to local people, that those pathways are open into those jobs. And those zones have kind of, again, come into their own in COVID, because they're kind of local hubs. They've got the relationships, they've got the connections. So yeah, I guess the final programme we've got is our London Borough of Culture programme, which again is kind of looking at, they have all been kind of pivoting to look at what they can do to support communities hit by COVID. This year, the London Borough of Culture is in Brent, which I think is actually the hardest, or one of the hardest hit places in the whole of the UK in terms of COVID. Lots of social housing challenges, lots of health challenges, really, really high up in terms of deaths of COVID. So actually it is, good that our Borough of Culture programme is happening in that borough. And, the team are really kind of pivoting what they're doing to support local communities. They've been doing an extraordinary amount. I think the only other thing I'd mention is that there's a kind of strand of work around regulation. So, thinking about licensing, thinking about how, we can fast track allowing people to do things in public spaces, drive-in cinemas, how we can kind of like fast track licensing and policy changes in that way. But equally, we're kind of super worried about planning law. We don't want to see planning kind of like deregulated in a way that then ends up hurting culture, and we lose a lot of spaces. So it's a complicated picture. We've got to kind of keep on top of it.
Thank you. Those are incredibly enlightening replies. I'm aware that it is whatever hour you are plus 15 minutes, and therefore I want to be timely on this because I'm aware of the sort of the constraints on people's time and how zoomed out we are, and I'd rather leave people asking for more. I would say that Marcel in Buenos Aires and Sari in Salford have both asked extremely interesting questions, and I commit to in the future series highlighting those. So come back and we will address them. If I can tempt these discussants back, I'll have them here to answer it too. But thank you to everybody who has been on this. I thought it was an extremely interesting and important conversation, and thank you profoundly to Manal and to Kim and to Justine for taking the time, the thought, and the consideration to be honest and insightful. So thank you everybody very much, and you'll be hearing from us soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian.
All right. See ya.
Great talking to you all.
Great to see you all.